Good morning, Salome B here, and I want to talk about the Dred Scott case real fast because the Dred Scott case is the case that stripped African Americans of a lot of rights in the 1856. And then the Slave Act came after it, the Fugitive Slave Act, where you were deemed a slave if you didn't say otherwise. You were deemed a slave. So these two acts are what stripped African Americans of their rights that they had before 1856. Now, I hear a lot of African Americans when we talk about the Constitution, and the Constitution is very important right now because a lot of lawlessness is taking place in America right now, and a lot of African Americans are getting hurt. And they're getting hurt because of this case. This case, the ruling stated that the Supreme Court ruled that Americans of African descent, whether free or slave, were not American citizens and could not sue in federal court. And the courts also ruled that Congress lacked the power to ban slavery in the U.S. territories. Okay, so this is the case that tells blacks that they are not American citizens. And this is why a lot of African Americans, when you bring up the Constitution, they'll say, oh, the Constitution doesn't protect us. And they say this because they've already been programmed that they are not American citizens. So this case actually got African Americans to waive their constitutional rights without knowing that this was because of a case that was immorally and illegally stripping the indigenous African Americans of their identity. This case also stripped African Americans of the rights to the Constitution, because it put in their mind that you're not a citizen, so you cannot use the Constitution. This is why African Americans could not sue in federal court or any court, because they were deemed not citizens. So this is why African Americans were pummeled, ran over, lynched, fried, died, laid to the side, everything. This is why this case should be, if African Americans who are voting for Trump, this is one of the cases that needs to be stricken down as unconstitutional, because it is a historical case that snatched the rights of indigenous African Americans that were indigenous to this soil. Now, I have a book called Slavery in Virginia. There were at least 90 to 80,000 slaves shipped here from Africa during the Atlantic slave trade, but it wasn't a million or a trillion, nothing like that. It was about 90,000 to 70,000, and the population was more African American than Caucasian because of the shipments of slaves into Virginia. And Virginia could not stop it because there were people actually going into the courts claiming African Americans as property. So this is the case that always should be reviewed when you think about the years of African Americans' rights being pummeled to the ground, treated as if they don't have any rights because of this immoral law that was decided by Democratic sitting judges on the Supreme Court. Because at the time in 1856, the Democrats ruled the House of Representatives. So if you are still voting Democrat, you need to ask yourself, why am I voting Democrat when this party is the party that said I am not an American citizen, when I actually was an American citizen because my indigenous ancestor resided on this part of America, on the North American shores? How do I allow a party like this to tell me that they are rooting for me when they were the ones that said that I had no rights because I wasn't an American citizen? So when I see, these Democrats protesting against Brett Kavanaugh because they're scared because the Constitution is going to ring and the Constitution is going to be enforced, because since the Democrats have been in office, the Constitution hasn't really been enforced. They've been ignoring the Constitution. They've been making law as they go along, and that's lawlessness. We don't need too much man-made law. We need to stick with the Charter, the Constitution, which comes from divine law. So take a look at the Dred Scott case. Put a mental note in your mind that this is the case that snatched away African American citizenship and deemed them to be non-citizens, and this is why they've always been treated as non-citizens. They've been treated worse than any immigrant ever. They've been treated worse. So remember this case. Remember Dred Scott. Look at his eyes. Remember, he is the one that was used as a scapegoat to steal African American citizenship. Like, share, subscribe. So long be. Have a great day.